great pleasure to introduce to you James Hiebert. He told me that he started teaching high school mathematics many years ago. Wouldn't tell me how many, but he has taught everything from basic math to calculus in high school. But right now, he's the Robert Barkley Professor of Education at the University of Delaware, where he teaches in programs of teacher preparation, professional development, and doctoral studies. He's co-authored the book, and perhaps many of you have read this book, Making Sense, Teaching and Learning Mathematics with Understanding and the Teaching Gap, Best Ideas from the World's Teachers for Improving Education in the Classroom. He has served as the director of the mathematics portion of the 1999 TIMS video study. He's currently a PI on the NSF-funded Mid-Atlantic Center for Teaching and Learning Mathematics. One of his favorite things to do is to go hiking in the Glacier Park, which I'm sure is where he'd rather be. So help me to introduce to you James Hiebert.
Thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction. And thanks to all of you for coming out on a rainy day. I'd like to talk for a few minutes about this topic that's showing up on the slide, guaranteeing improved classroom teaching in 20 years. What should we do tomorrow? I want to clarify a meaning of this title in case there might be some confusion. The point of this talk is not to give you a clever idea to do in your class tomorrow. So if you're looking for a cute thing to do, you'll probably need to find another session. I'm interested primarily in understanding what sort of path we go down together as a community of educators if our interest is the first part of that title, ensuring that down the road we're doing a much more effective job of teaching mathematics in classrooms than we are today. So I'd like to begin with a pretty sobering fact, and that is that teaching in a typical mathematics classroom in the United States has not changed very much in the past century. For as long as we've kept records of how we teach mathematics in schools, it looks like we're doing pretty much the same thing we did 100 years ago. Now, there are changes at the margins. We use concrete materials, we use technology, we put students in small groups. But by teaching, I'm talking about the way we interact with students about the content. That is, the kind of questions we ask them, the sort of responses we expect, the kind of explanations we provide, and so on. That core of teaching has remained pretty much the same. Now, I will have to add a caveat here. Not in your classrooms. That's why you're here. I mean, the fact that you're here means that you're probably already on a different path. Either yourselves, if you're a classroom teacher, or if you're working with teachers in a particular school, you probably have access to quite a few classrooms where instruction looks substantively different than it did 20 years ago or 50 years ago. But we're only a few in this room. And in the typical classroom, for the average student in the United States, math instruction has stayed pretty much the same. What's remarkable about this is that this is true despite wave after wave of reform. So most of you are familiar with the fact that we're really fond of reforms in the United States. And we go through one after the next, and we've been doing that for at least 70 years. So in spite of that, the core of teaching, the way that teachers interact with students about mathematics, has stayed remarkably the same. Why is that? Why haven't these efforts worked? I'd like to explore this afternoon one basic reason for that. And it is that the way we have thought about teaching, the way we've conducted our reforms has really underappreciated the core of teaching, has not understood very well what it takes to change the way we interact with students about the mathematics. If we're going to understand teaching, I'd like to propose that there are at least two truths that we need to understand pretty deeply. One is that teaching is a cultural activity. What I mean by that is that people learn to teach by growing up in the culture, by being students in classrooms for 12 years, for 16 years, for teaching when they begin like their favorite fourth grade teacher did, by imitating what they've seen before. Now, I think all of you have probably had the experience of watching kids play school. So by the time they're 8 or 9 years old, even 7 years old, they can play a remarkably good version of school. They know how the teacher acts, they know how the students are supposed to act, they know pretty quickly what math teaching is like and how you do that. So we learn to teach mathematics by growing up in the culture. A second thing that's important to understand is that changing the way we teach needs to focus directly on the core of teaching, on the methods we use to interact with students about mathematics, rather than at the margins. And we do a lot of stuff at the margins, but we spend relatively little time trying to understand that sort of those key learning moments when the teacher's interacting with the students, the way they're talking with the students about mathematics and the way the students are talking. It turns out that most reform policies don't address these problems directly. They don't understand, I think, well enough what teaching involves. And just to illustrate that, I'd like to spend a minute or two looking at two very popular reforms in the country today. And we could pick a lot of them, but here are two of my favorites. There's a lot of current interest in improving the quality of classroom instruction. If you read educational reform documents, if you read the newspapers, if you read the media, if you read educators talking or writing, there's a lot of recognition that if we're going to help students learn more than they're learning now, we need to improve the quality of classroom instruction. Usually, that conversation shifts immediately to the following claim. So, we've got to find more qualified teachers. I'm all for highly qualified teachers. And many of the current reforms say that the key to a highly qualified teacher is increased subject matter knowledge. So the more mathematics you know, the better teacher you're likely to be. So this policy of recruiting better teachers often translates into recruit teachers that have strong math backgrounds. Again, I'm all in favor of that. But just think for a moment about your own experience in studying mathematics in schools. You started in elementary school in the primary grades, went into middle school, did some mathematics there, went on to high school, took more math classes, went to college, took some more math classes. Now, if this reform policy is all that it took, then the quality of instruction you should have been receiving should have been getting better and better and better and better as you moved up through the grades, right? Because the teachers you were receiving instruction from had more and more subject matter knowledge. And if any of you have had the pleasure of taking graduate mathematics courses, the instruction should have been spectacularly amazing. So that doesn't match most of our experiences. It doesn't mean that subject matter knowledge isn't important, it just simply means that's not enough. If we expect to improve the quality of classroom instruction, it's not enough to say we need to provide teachers with good subject matter knowledge and then hope for the best. There's another reason. So these smart, better teachers who have strong subject matter knowledge will have inherited the same methods that other teachers use. That is, because teaching is a cultural activity, teachers usually don't invent their own methods. They usually inherit them from teachers they've had before. It's the same for all of us. We've all grown up in this culture. But there's another issue with regard to recruiting better teachers. Suppose that it did improve instruction. The effect would only last a short time, a relatively short time. As soon as those teachers leave, the other teachers that replace them would have to start over. It's not a good way to ensure that 20, 30 years down the road, instruction is going to be improved. There was an article recently in the New York Times that said that in the next 4 years, a third of the 3.2 million school teachers in the United States are eligible for retirement. A third of 3.2 million teachers. That's an awful lot of classrooms that are going to be starting over in the next few years. So we can do better than this. And in just a minute, I'd like to suggest some ways we might do that. But first, I'd like to look at a second policy. Hold teachers accountable. Now, to me, this is really based on sort of an odd premise. It's kind of like saying, you know, all of our teachers out there know how to teach really effectively, but they just don't feel like doing it right now. So if we hold their feet to the fire, if we hold them accountable, they'll say, oh shoot, I better take out my effective method now and begin teaching that way. The problem, at least with the teachers I've met and worked with, the problem is not motivation. The teachers I know are teaching the best they know how. The problem is a learning problem. The problem is we need to help teachers learn how to teach more effectively. Okay? We need to provide better learning opportunities that put them on a different path toward improving their instruction over time. So I'd like to talk about an alternative approach to doing this. And the alternative is actually not rocket science. It's a fairly simple idea, but it changes the way we would do things in schools. It's based on the idea that what we need to do is engage teachers in studying their own practice and improving it a little bit at a time. This kind of approach, I claim, would appreciate what we know to be true about teaching and about how to change teaching. It would assume, however, that all teachers can learn. Now, it's sort of interesting to me that most of us have heard a lot of inspiring talks over the last years about the fact that all students can learn, and most of us believe that. But we've heard relatively little talk about the fact that all teachers can learn. Surely, if all students can learn, all teachers can learn. And what I'm going to describe is based squarely on the premise that teachers can learn to teach more effectively over time if we provide the right learning opportunities. Unfortunately, we run into a problem right away in thinking about how to do this, because teacher learning is itself a cultural activity. Just like teaching, there are particular ways we have of thinking about how teachers should learn, and we practice those over and over again. We need to break out of some of these molds and traditions we have so that we now have at least what I think of as a new way of answering the question, why hasn't teaching changed? It's really at the basis because the opportunities for teacher learning haven't changed. We've been using the same sorts of teacher learning opportunities for years and years. In spite of the fact that there are some changes these days, and you read about them periodically, about the kind of learning opportunities that are set up for teachers, it's surprising how many hundreds of workshops go on regularly where teachers will pick up an activity to do in their classroom next week, but that doesn't engage teachers in studying and improving teaching in the way that matters most to kids. Okay, we really work at the margins of this rather than getting at the heart of what makes mathematics teaching effective. So, what should we do? Where do we start? What I'd like to suggest is that we begin by thinking about the kind of learning opportunities that focus teachers on studying their practice, on analyzing the way they interact with students about mathematics and thinking about better ways to do that. And I'd like to lay out some suggestions for how we do that. But before we go there, I want to let you know that, again, this is not a quick fix. And Americans, by the way, have an insatiable appetite for quick fixes. We're really addicted to the idea that we should be able to change it tomorrow or next year at the latest. What I'm going to suggest doesn't go there. It's an entirely different way of thinking about this. The work that I'm going to suggest we engage teachers in and that we do ourselves is hard and tedious. And the results show up only gradually over time. So we sort of have to ask ourselves, do we really want to do this? Are we really committed to doing things in a different way that ensure improvement down the road, but don't show up as amazing results tomorrow? So what I'd like to do is describe the settings in which this kind of work goes on, and then talk about what work happens within these settings. Because the setting is really critical. And we know some things from research about what these settings should be like. So here's for starters. If teachers are going to work on their teaching, it's best if they organize themselves into groups. Anywhere from 3 to 6, even 2 to 6 works, but you need a partner. It's really hard to do this on your own. And there is one simple criterion for who belongs in the same group. And that is, it's teachers who share exactly the same learning goals for their students. The reason is because these groups are going to be working together on improving the teaching they do to help students learn those particular things. If one teacher in the group is interested in helping their students learn something else, the progress of the group won't be of great interest or value. So in order for all the learnings of all members of the group to be fed back into the group and to be sort of help propel the group forward, the members of the group need to have the same learning goals for students. This means probably in most schools these will be grade level groups, and these will be focused on the same sort of subject matter. So you need to find, even if it's a teacher in a neighboring school, you need to find a small group of teachers who share the same exact learning goals. Not general learning goals like improved problem solving, but very particular learning goals that apply to individual lessons, for example. Teachers need to meet weekly. And this is probably the biggest demand in terms of this process. Monthly meetings don't work. People just lose momentum. If you're really serious about this and you're really going to make changes, you need to meet weekly. You need to adhere to some very simple rules to make people's lives easier. You need to begin and end on time. No one can be absent. You can't walk in late. This is a sacred time every week where people get together and work hard on their teaching. You need to follow an agenda that's set beforehand with particular goals for that meeting. And you need to spend most of the meeting focused on achieving those goals for the meeting. A lot of the work will involve selecting a small segment of teaching to study. Maybe just one lesson for a few weeks, but something that's fairly small so that you can get your head around it and look at the details of teaching. And most of the work should occur during the meeting, no homework. If it gets too much, people can't sustain it. We're all way too busy already, so keeping the work at the meeting site is important. A second feature of this kind of work, and this is where I think a lot of you come in, and that is that these kind of groups absolutely require really careful and hands-on leadership. The leader needs to help the group get organized, help select the learning goals, keep the focus on studying teaching, and help teachers persist in the face of very small improvements. The interesting thing here, though, is that there are a number of research studies that have shown that the changes that matter most to teachers and that keep them engaged are changes in teaching, no matter how small, that result in some documentable change in student learning, no matter how small. In other words, if you're working on a lesson that you want to teach, and you think of a different kind of question that you could ask to engage students, or you think of a different number combination that would help them see something more clearly, and you can see that that made a difference to kids, that kind of link between what I do in the classroom and how careful I am about what I say and how I prepare, see that making a difference to students is very motivating and will sustain teachers in this work for a long time. So the changes don't need to be big, but they need to be linked with something that's changing in students' learning. The leader also needs to find access to new ideas that might help. Not necessarily provide them yourself, but know where to find them and keep new ideas streaming into the group. And then, as leaders emerge in the group, sort of working yourself out of a job, leaving the leadership to someone else, and helping another group. Okay, that's the setting part of it. Now, what happens during this time, this sort of sacred time of the week? Basically, the process involves slowing down what teachers do anyway, but often in a very quick cycle in their heads. So all teachers engage in some kind of planning, then they implement a lesson, then they think about it later and say, gee, how did that go? I wonder. Maybe I'll do something else different next time. So teachers do this kind of work regularly. This is not alien to teachers. The point is to slow this work down and unpack the methods we use to interact with students. Look at those very carefully and think about whether there are more effective ways of interacting. There's one thing that's important to realize here about this kind of work. It's totally under the control of teachers. It doesn't require any big fancy resources. This is the kind of work that teachers are best positioned to do. They're closest to the classroom. They engage in this in some form anyway. This kind of work of slowing down teaching and studying it is completely under their control. It's the one thing that they can control, their own teaching. So this is an important place to put a lot of emphasis and effort and work. But that doesn't mean this is easy. This is really hard. And one of the reasons it's hard is because it requires a change in mind. It requires a change in what we think teaching is. Teaching is now not just delivering instruction in front of 30 kids. Teaching is studying my own practice, working with my colleagues to improve that practice a little bit each time we look at it, each time we look at a lesson, and so on. Teaching becomes teaching improvement as well as delivery of instruction. So now, here are a few more specific suggestions about what it means to slow down the cycle of teaching. First of all, clarifying again the specific learning goals for students that are going to be the target of the work, of the teacher work. Then selecting a few lessons that help students achieve those particular goals, and then analyzing the lessons. Developing some hypotheses about where in that lesson are students going to learn what we want them to learn. Where is that going to happen exactly? And how is it going to happen? What's the activity that's most responsible, that's going to be the sort of key activity? What are the key learning moments in that lesson? Here's where consultants come in, where the new ideas come in, because sometimes when you look at a lesson like that and analyze it, you find out that there might be an instructional activity that could work even better. And so you revise the lesson with this new instructional activity in mind. Then the lesson is taught. Ideally, some members from the group that you work with are there to observe. Now let me pause right here and say, most of you might be thinking, that's impossible in my school because we're all busy all the time, nobody can leave their classroom to go watch another teacher teach, etc., etc. That's true in most cases. But some of you in this room are problem solvers about exactly that kind of thing. Figuring out how to free up a teacher to go watch their partner teach a lesson that they've planned together is one of the greatest learning experiences a teacher can have. And we've got to figure out ways of doing that. When someone observes a lesson that, let's say you observe a lesson that I'm teaching. Observing a lesson doesn't just mean sitting back and saying, wow, looks like kids are having a good time, this is really working well. What it means is saying, okay, ahead of time, where during that lesson do we think the real learning is going to take place? Let's identify those key moments. And when I'm observing, I'm going to be watching especially closely to those key moments to see if it worked like we predicted it would work. So there are times during the lesson where the observation needs to get cranked up a lot in intensity. And that's the critical information that you need to use to revise the lesson next time. In addition, it's important to collect student work and then use that work to help evaluate whether your predictions about how that lesson was going to go were accurate or not, whether they could be revised, whether the lesson could be improved. And finally, the lesson's revised and recorded. Other teachers can use that same lesson, maybe in a neighboring school, who have the same learning goals for their students. That's the process of slowing down the teaching cycle. So now I want to just step back and sort of summarize some of the major ideas here. Teachers need to work together to study teaching, the core of teaching. Leaders need to help coordinate and sustain the collaborative work groups. And studying teaching needs to become part of what it means to be a teacher at your school. This is what we do as teachers. The outcomes of this kind of work are improved lessons over time that can be shared, recorded, handed on to other teachers. But more than that, This kind of work really changes the way teachers think and understand teaching. Once again, the work is hard and tedious, and the results show up gradually as small improvements get made over time. So, again, are we willing to travel down this different path? The most frequent question that's asked about this kind of process is, yeah, okay, but won't this take years? Yep, it will. Absolutely, it will take years. We have a project going on at the University of Delaware with the faculty and the doctoral students there, working on improving the courses that we teach to our K through 8 pre-service teachers, the math courses. They take 3 math courses, and we've been working now for 7 years doing basically the kind of work that I described. And when we began, we gave ourselves 20 years to get these courses to be sort of the way we wanted them. 7, 8 years down the road, we've now extended that. We now think 25 years might be a better horizon. It's hard and it's tedious. But the things we've tried up till now haven't exactly been great successes. So remember, the waves and waves of reforms leave us today about the same place we were 100 years ago for the average student in the average classroom. So I think that maybe it's time we do something different. Maybe it's time to engage the thousands of teachers out there in the actual work of improving teaching. For one thing, they're the only ones that can improve teaching, right? They're in charge. I mean, they are the ones in front of the students who are interacting with the students. So if it's going to improve, they have to be engaged in it. But more than that, they're in the best position to do it. They are the ones who should be engaged in this work. And it's a matter of creating better learning opportunities that can be sustained over time. So this different path that's based on small changes accumulated over time that last and gradually build, is that better? I'm going to end with 2 quotes that I like a lot about this process, and they come from 2 very different people. The first is a Quaker theologian. How about that? Who wasn't necessarily talking about teaching when he said this. And I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. But Elton Trueblood made the comment a number of times that people who want to make a difference in other people's lives contribute to changes that matter means planting shade trees under which we know we will not sit. Isn't that a nice? Starting teacher work groups at your school that can be sustained over years is like planting a shade tree. The payoffs come quite a bit down the road. And I'm going to end by a quote from John Wooden, perhaps the best, most famous basketball coach of all time, who actually saw himself as a teacher primarily. While he was winning all those NCAA championships, he kept thinking himself as a teacher. And he did an extensive amount of work on studying his own practice and improving. And this is what he said: when you improve a little each day, eventually big things occur. Not tomorrow, not the next day, but eventually a big gain is made. Don't look for the big, quick improvement. Seek the small improvement one day at a time. That's the only way it happens, and when it happens, it lasts.